So, if you enjoy Shark Tank as much as I do, you've probably noticed that Mr. Wonderful is one of the most outspoken investors. But that doesn't always necessarily translate into results. Today, we're going to dive into his track record, and I'm going to show you exactly why being a tough negotiator may sometimes work against our very own Mr. Wonderful. Just like my other videos where I've done a deep dive on each of the sharks and their track record, I'm going to start this one off with some quick stats. So right off the bat, Kevin O'Leary has made 39 investments. Of those, 21 are still in operation, with 17 that, based on my best guess, have gone under. So, roughly 56% of his investment is still alive and chomping, which is, pretty much right in line with the other sharks for the most part. He's had 4 exits to date. And, he's actually done really well on some of his investments. So some of his top investments include Groovebook, where, he was able to buy a significant portion of that business, which was then later acquired by Shutterfly. I'm estimating he gained probably about a 77x on his investment, or roughly $5.8 million. He did that deal right alongside Mark Cuban. And so to the two of them, even though the company was only acquired for like 15 million bucks, they took out like 2/3 of the returns, which, it feels like a lot, especially given that the entrepreneur put in their like blood, sweat, and tears into the business. But on the flip side, the entrepreneur walked away with like $5 million. So, it's not like they're doing too bad. Another one of his successful investments is a company called Jump Forward, which was an app that helped communication between athletes and colleges and coaches and so forth. That ultimately ended up getting acquired by a company called Active that does a lot of things around sports and events. He was able to turn that $300,000 investment into what I'm estimating to be about $7 million, or about a 24x return. And then the last one that I thought was interesting is the only one to invest about 200 grand into a company called Total Merchant Solutions. That company was ultimately acquired, and based on the information I was able to gather, my best guess is he took that 200 grand and turned it into about $5 million. Now, as you'll notice, if you watched any of my other Shark Tank videos where I do a deep dive on the sharks, all 3 of those investments, his top performing investments, all generated cash. Like, they're not just valued at that high number, they actually sold for a pretty meaningful amount of money. 2 of them are, albeit my estimates on what he made, but based on the information I could find, those 2 companies were actually seemed to be doing pretty well. And so I'd be surprised if he didn't actually end up generating a pretty good return. That said, I don't have any, special knowledge about the case. But nonetheless, look, getting a 24, 25x return and upwards of a 77x return on your investment is pretty good, especially because Mr. Wonderful tends to write larger checks than his peers. His average check is about $100,000. On some of these where he's done really well, he's written larger checks, 200 grand, 300 grand. In the cases of Jump and Total Merchant. That's really helped drive a lot of his returns. If you look at the rest of his investments, there's like 1 or 2 other ones that have seen an increase in valuation. For the most part, a lot of his companies have either gone under, about 17 of the 39. 4 of them have gone up in valuation and or been acquired. So, there's still a lot sitting there in the portfolio that's TBD. We'll see if it ends up getting acquired, going public. Probably not go public. I didn't see anything in his portfolio that led me to believe that he's got one of those in there. But, there's probably some more that will end up getting acquired because they're generating revenue, growing, doing well enough. In addition to writing an average check of about $100,000, his highest check he's ever written was $2.5 million, which for a long time was the largest check and the largest deal on Shark Tank. His peer, Robert, ended up beating him out on that not too long after that. And then his lowest check is about 25K. So, that's a pretty big delta of almost $2.5 million between his largest and smallest check. But, I think, looking at his deals, it's mostly around the 100K mark, which is about what you should suspect. The other thing that's interesting about Mr. Wonderful is that I think he's kind of a deal junkie. And so he's always looking for like creative deals. He's done more like royalty or licensing or whatever deals than any of his peers. He's done about 4 of those. And frankly, he's done really well at them, which makes sense why he would do them. He's invested about $153,000 in those and generated about $2.4 million in licensing revenue. It's interesting. So in venture, there is this concept called RBF, or revenue-based financing, which works very much like a royalty. So essentially what an investor does is they come in and they say, oh yeah, you need $1 million. Okay, I'll give you $1 million, but then I want 10% of all of your revenues going forward until you pay me back $2 million, whatever it might be. And these models can be really effective because unlike a loan where you're going to get paid back a certain amount every month, regardless of how revenue and how the business is performing, in this case, it can kind of move up and down with the revenue. So if you have a business that's super seasonal and it's really hard for you to make a consistent debt payment, well, RBF can be a really interesting solution to help you solve that problem. And then compared to equity, it's nice because you're not giving up control of your business. You're not giving up equity in your business, which honestly can be one of the most expensive forms of capital, is selling equity. And so these models end up being pretty interesting. They also create really good alignment in the case of Kevin O'Leary because, he's got this brand, he's got connections and so forth. And so now he's incentivized to push sales, right? Now, if he was an equity owner, he would still be incentivized. But in this case, because he's actually taking a portion of revenues, he's even more incentivized to really drive that top line revenue growth. Which is different. Like if you're an equity owner, you want to see top line growth, but you really want to see like bottom line growth. You want to see like profits, right? Because that's how you make your money, is based on the profits. And in his case, he's like doesn't care about profits. He's just like, let's just grow this thing really big, which can be good and bad, right? If you're the equity owner and he's sitting there saying push, push, push on revenue at all costs, that may not always be the best thing for your business and for you. But nonetheless, like it does create this really interesting incentive paradigm for him. And he does it well. Like he's done very well with this. In fact, arguably, since he's generated like almost a 16x on those investments, maybe he should just stick to that because it's a lot better than his overall investments across his entire portfolio. Let's talk about those. So to date, he's invested $7.5 million, which is right in the middle of the other sharks. I think Mark Cuban's invested a little bit more. Robert has definitely invested more. So, it's up there, but it's still more than Barbara and Daymond. Based on my calculations, he's been able to turn that $7.5 million into $34.6 million, resulting in a 4.6x return on his invested dollars, which is pretty good, but that's not, including all of the facts here. So 4.6, if you watch my other videos, is not as good, definitely not as good as Daymond. He is by far the best. And if you haven't watched that video, when you're done watching this one, go check that one out. But it's not as good as Barbara or Mark Cuban. He's certainly not the worst, but definitely not the best investor. And when you consider that he is the least prolific, or in other words, he writes the fewest checks of all the other investors, it kind of makes it even less impressive in my opinion. The other thing to keep in mind is that he's lost over 50% of the capital he's invested. In fact, of the capital he's lost, 66% of that was lost in one single deal. Yep, that $2.5 million deal that he invested in, yeah, he lost basically all of it. That was a company called Zips, which was a portable wine product that came in a beautiful looking plastic wine glass for single serve wine that you could take to sporting events and, other activities, outdoor events, whatever it might be. And he was like so bullish on this that he wrote this $2.5 million check all by himself. Company never really went anywhere. At most generated about $1.5 million in revenue. I can't really imagine that they were profitable at all at that amount. So yeah, kind of a tough deal to take that big of a zero. I mean, basically a third of his invested capital, total write-off in one deal. And that brings me to this idea of portfolio construction. So if we were to look at Mr. Wonderful Capital Partners, as though Kevin O'Leary was a fund in of himself making these investments, then you'd really want to ask yourself, how is he going about constructing his portfolio? Because it ends up being a super important question. If I were an LP looking at his fund, my biggest concern would be the fact that he invested a third of his total invested capital into one deal. Now, in the big scheme of things, he's worth roughly $400 million, and these investments only represent, less than 2% of his total net worth. So not like a huge gamble from that perspective on a total basis. But if you look at it as though it were a fund and he had a $7.5 million fund and he plowed 2.5 million of it into one deal and lost it, I would be really concerned. In fact, even if he put $2.5 million into one deal and didn't lose it, I would be concerned because that just feels like a lot of risk. For the most part, you want to be really clear as a venture investor about what your strategy is and stick to it. And different strategies can be effective. You've got some angels that are spray and pray. They write a relatively small check into a lot of deals, and they have a lot of discipline not to write big checks when they get overly excited. I think if you look at Barbara and Daymond's portfolios, that's a good example of that, where the biggest check they ever write is 350 or 500 grand respectively. On the other hand, you could have a more concentrated portfolio. So maybe you say, hey, I'm only going to make, 15 investments instead of 50 investments like Barbara and Daymond. In that case, you're taking very concentrated bets and you're going to have to be super involved. And I've seen that strategy play out as well. The problem with Mr. Wonderful is he's doing a little bit of everything. He's investing these big checks of $2.5 million into like just a couple deals. And I don't know how involved he really is on those. And then he's also writing lots of little checks, hoping one of them pans out. And frankly, that can be a really, really tough strategy. See, the other thing that I think is interesting about Mr. Wonderful is the number of deals he's done, because it feels like he throws in an offer on every single company that pitches on Shark Tank. Rarely is he the first one to bow out. And even when he does bow out, sometimes he comes back in. He's also like the most likely to partner with other people. 64% of his deals, he's partnered with them. And when you take those two things into consideration, that 64% of his deals, he's done it with a partner, and the fact that he's done the fewest number of deals than his peers by like 10 deals. So like a lot, like he's done, 80% of what the other sharks have done. I really think it speaks to his investment strategy where he's really aggressive with entrepreneurs. I mean, his name, Mr. Wonderful, is kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? It's a joke on like how unwonderful he really is when in the negotiating process. And I think it really turns away a lot of entrepreneurs. I think it's a really important lesson for those of you that are aspiring venture capitalists in that venture investing is kind of like dating. And whoever's the most attractive gets the deal done. So look, if the entrepreneur is absolutely crushing it and being super successful, then it makes sense to try to be nice to them and cater to them and be helpful. But it also matters being nice to the entrepreneurs that aren't doing as well, because that story gets around. And you don't want to be known as the jerk to entrepreneurs. You want to be known as the super helpful, thoughtful, considerate, easy-killed investor that they want to work with, that's going to be there with them through, the good times and the bad times. That's how you end up winning the really good deals, is by building a great reputation. And so I think it's interesting that despite throwing out the most number of offers, he's able to close the fewest number of deals. And the deals he does close, 2/3 of the time, he's doing them with somebody else. He needs someone else to prop up his reputation in order to get a deal done. Now, all of that said, it makes it sound like I think Mr. Wonderful is a bad investor. And here's why he's actually probably the best investor of all of them. And that is because he actually generates cash returns. So if we look at all the other investors, most of the other sharks' returns are paper gains, which means on paper, the company is doing really well and the valuation has gone up, but they haven't actually generated cash on those investments yet. Now, hopefully those companies continue to do well and they get acquired or they go public and they end up generating great cash returns. But for the most part, those are TBD. In the case of Kevin O'Leary, he's actually returned $20 million on his investments, which is way more than his peers. In fact, if you look at this metric called DPI, which is distributions paid in, which is simply a measure of every dollar that I've given an investor to invest, or that Kevin O'Leary has invested, how many dollars has he given me back in cash? Not just like paper gains, but actual cash in my pocket. He's returned $2.70, which is much better. It's like 10 times what some of the other sharks have returned in cash to their own wallets, or to their hypothetical investors, you know, if you were to invest in their funds. And so on the one hand, you know, being a tough negotiator maybe costs him some really interesting deals. On the other hand, he's actually been able to perform well and actually been able to generate real cash returns, which, let's be honest, like, you can't eat paper gains. You can only eat cash gains, right? Those are the only ones at the end of the day that really even matter. And so even though his like total returns are maybe not the best, he has been the best at actually generating real cash in his pocket. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other one on Mark Cuban, where I do the same breakdown and analyze his track record and his investment approach as a Shark Tank. If you enjoyed this, be sure to check out my other video with Daymond and learn why he is one of the best and worst investors among the sharks. Thanks.